On the morning of March 28, 1757, the air above Paris was cold and sharp, the kind of air that seems to carry sound further, to etch every scream into the memory of the city. By noon, the Place de Grève was no longer a square, but an arena. Windows overflowed with nobles in embroidered coats. The streets below were packed with merchants, beggars, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Vendors shouted over the murmur of anticipation, selling wine and meat pies as though this were a festival, not a killing. In the center stood the scaffold, wood darkened with age and something darker still. Around it, ropes hung like veins awaiting a body, and 4 restless horses stamped their hooves against the cobblestones. They were strong beasts, bred for labor, yet they shivered as if sensing the unnatural work to come. This was not the execution of a murderer, not the punishment of a traitor who had sold his country's secrets to an enemy. No, this was for a servant, a man whose name most had never heard until he dared to commit the one crime that the France of Louis XIV could never forgive, laying a hand on the sacred body of the king. His weapon had been no more than a small penknife. The wound he inflicted was little more than a scratch. But in a kingdom where the monarch ruled by divine right, where the king was God's anointed on earth, that scratch was heresy written in flesh. His name was Robert François Damiens, and today he would be torn apart by horses, the last man in France to suffer this medieval death in an age that liked to call itself enlightened. The sentence was not meant merely to kill him. It was meant to erase him, to scatter his body and his memory like ashes in the wind. It was theater, punishment as performance, designed to sear itself into the minds of all who watched. Yet, as the hour approached, something in the crowd shifted. Beneath the excitement, there was unease, as if the people sensed they were about to witness something they would not be able to forget or forgive. For this was more than an execution. It was a mirror held up to the face of royal power, reflecting not majesty, but fear. And when the first cries rang out, when the horses strained and the ropes went taut, Paris learned what absolute power looks like when it feels the breath of rebellion, not strength, but cruelty, naked and desperate. What happened on that cold March day would stain the city's soul for decades to come and help sow the seeds of a revolution that would one day bring the palace itself crashing down. Part 1. A Kingdom of Glass and Shadows. France in 1757 was a kingdom wrapped in gold and wrought. From a distance it shone like a jewel, flawless under the winter sun. Versailles stood as its crown, an impossible palace of mirrored halls, silk-draped chambers and fountains that spilled water like liquid diamonds. The gardens stretched into infinity, their symmetry an echo of the divine order the monarchy claimed to embody. Servants swept the marble floors until they gleamed. Musicians filled the air with harpsichord and violin. Courtiers moved like painted figurines through corridors scented with roses and powdered wigs. This was the world Louis XIV had built, the Sun King, whose reign had burned so bright it seemed eternal. But the sun was gone. His great-grandson Louis XV sat in his place, a man still called bien-aimé, the well-beloved. But the words were hollow now, repeated more out of tradition than truth. For the monarchy, the king's flesh was not just flesh, it was sacred, inviolable, touched by God himself. To harm it was to harm the divine order of the universe. This belief had been polished like gold leaf guarded with the vigilance of religion itself, drilled into the nobility, preached from pulpits, and written into the very bones of the law. It was not just politics, it was theology made flesh. The king was the axis upon which the realm turned. To strike him was not rebellion, but blasphemy. And yet, beyond the gilt and the marble, the air was thick with change. In the salons of Paris, candles burned into the small hours as men and women traded ideas that the court would call dangerous. Words like reason, liberty, equality. In the shadowy corners of provincial coffee houses, pamphlets smuggled past the royal censor passed from hand to hand, carrying the voices of Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau, each page a quiet act of defiance against both throne and altar. The cracks in the royal facade were widening. Louis XV was no sun king. He lacked the unshakable poise of his predecessor, the ability to turn power into theater. War with Britain had bled the treasury dry. Defeats overseas, in Canada, in India, had stained the honor of the French crown. The grandeur of Versailles began to feel like a painted mask over a hollow face. Rumors of the king's mistresses, of private excesses while the countryside starved, spread like whispers in the wind, growing louder with each telling. Criticism, once muttered in confidence, now found voice in the streets, in taverns, even in the very markets where royal edicts were posted. It was in this charged atmosphere, where the old order clung desperately to its divine mask while the new order sharpened its knives, that Robert François Damiens lived his small, unremarkable life. He was a domestique, a servant without fortune or future, moving from one employer to the next like a ghost no one cared to remember. He served judges, clerks, and minor nobles, hearing their conversations as he poured their wine, polished their silver, or stood silently in a corner while they debated the failings of the crown. History rarely notices such men. Their names vanish with their wages. But on one winter evening, as the sun dipped behind the marble courtyards of Versailles, this ordinary servant stepped out of obscurity and into a moment that would make him immortal, not for what he achieved, but for how the kingdom would choose to destroy him. Part 2. The Strike in the Marble Courtyard. January 5th, 1757. Versailles lay under the grip of winter, the air brittle and thin, each breath a small ghost in the cold. The marble courtyard shimmered under a pale, dying sun, its stones slick with a delicate skin of frost. Hooves clattered faintly in the distance as royal grooms readied horses for the hunt. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint perfume of the courtiers, a fragrance of lilies, musk, and powder that clung to the air like invisible velvet. Louis emerged from the palace wrapped in layers of heavy winter garments. Fox fur framed his face. Gold embroidery winked in the low light. Around him moved his guards in crisp formation, a wall of steel and protocol. Courtiers clustered close, their silks and brocades rustling with each shift of the crowd, their smiles sharp as they murmured the calculated flattery of survival. And somewhere in that glittering swarm stood Robert François Damiens. To most eyes, he was nothing, a figure that barely registered, another servant in plain, serviceable clothes, blending into the background like shadow against stone. He kept his head low, his expression unreadable. In his right hand, curled discreetly against his palm, lay a folding penknife, small, unremarkable, the sort a man might use to peel fruit or trim a quill. The moment unfolded almost before anyone could see it. A step forward, a flicker of movement, the brief glint of steel catching the winter sun. The thrust, awkward, almost uncertain, slid against the king's thick coat, the blade's point grazing skin beneath layers of wool and fur. It was a wound so slight it might have been mistaken for a pinprick, but in the grammar of monarchy, it was a sentence written in blood. Gasps ripped through the marble courtyard. The air filled with the scuffle of boots as guards surged forward, their swords half drawn before they had even reached him. Someone shouted that the king had been struck. Another voice, louder, called for the assassin's immediate death. Panic licked at the edges of the scene, sharp and fast. Louis XV, pale beneath the fur, pressed his hand to the spot where the knife had found him. When he drew it away, his fingers bore only a thin smear of red, barely more than a paper cut. Yet his face had changed. The set of his jaw and the hard focus in his eyes said he understood what this meant. It was not the blood, but the breach, the audacity of touching the untouchable that shook the air around him. Damiens was seized and forced to the cobblestones. The cold bit into his cheek through the frost as shackles clamped around his wrists. He did not fight. He did not spit curses or cry for mercy. Instead, he stared with a kind of startled calm, as though the enormity of his own act had only now struck him. "I did not mean to kill him," he reportedly said, his voice steady despite the hands gripping his arms, "only to touch him, to make him think of his people's unhappiness." But Versailles was not built to hear such words. Intent meant nothing here. In the world of kings, the body of the sovereign was an altar. To touch it with a blade, however small, was to commit a kind of sacrilege that no confession could erase. As the winter sun slipped lower and the steam from the horse's nostrils curled into the cold air, Robert François Damiens was dragged away. His fate was no longer in question. It had been sealed in the instant steel met royal flesh. The only uncertainty that remained was how far the crown would go to make an example of him. Part 3. The Trial of Fear. They took him to the Conciergerie, a fortress of stone and shadow, crouched on the banks of the Seine, older than the memory of most who walked its halls. Its walls were slick with the damp of centuries, its air heavy with the ghosts of heretics, conspirators, and traitors who had breathed their last behind its iron doors. The cells smelled of rot and mildew. Chains clinked in the dark like the faint echoes of those already gone. Here, Robert François Damiens waited, not for judgment, but for the confirmation of a sentence already decided in the marble corridors of Versailles. The interrogations began at once. He was questioned by magistrates whose powdered wigs hid eyes sharp as knives. The air in the chamber was stale, heavy with the scent of tallow candles. Each question came like a blow. Who helped you? Who ordered this? Was there a plot? Was there gold? Was there a promise? The answers shifted, sometimes confused, sometimes stubborn, sometimes tinged with a kind of strange honesty. But the truth didn't matter. Beneath the official language, there was an unspoken certainty. The verdict had been written before the first question was asked. In the eyes of the law, Damiens was no ordinary criminal. He was a parricide, the attempted murderer of the father of his people. In France, this was not merely treason. It was a form of deicide. The king's body was sacred. To touch it with a blade was to violate the divine order itself. The Parliament of Paris, the kingdom's highest court, took on the role of judge and executioner. There was no defense that could be made, no context that could soften the blow. The act alone, however feeble, was enough to summon the harshest punishment in France's ancient code: écartèlement, dismemberment by 4 horses. And this would not be a clean death, it would be a ritual. Before the ropes and the hooves, there would be the degradations, each designed to echo the crime. His flesh torn with red-hot pincers as if to strip away the offense from his skin. Molten lead poured into the wounds, sealing them with fire like the wrath of God made liquid. His right hand, the hand that had dared touch the king, burned with sulfur until it was nothing but ash and bone. These were not acts of justice, they were acts of theater, the choreography of fear. The monarchy understood spectacle, it understood the language of symbols. This was to be a living allegory, a slow, brutal sermon delivered to every soul who dared imagine that the king could be touched. When the sentence was read aloud, it was done with ceremonial gravity, as though the words themselves were part of the punishment. The execution would take place in the Place de Grève, the very heart of Paris, so that thousands could see with their own eyes what happened when the crown was threatened. Months of preparation followed. 4 of the strongest horses in the city were chosen and conditioned for the work ahead. Ropes and chains were tested for strength. The executioners, men who had inherited the craft from fathers and grandfathers, consulted with the old records. For the punishment was so rare it belonged more to memory than to practice. For the court, this was about more than vengeance. It was principle, a declaration that even the smallest hand raised against the king would be crushed under the weight of divine authority. For the city, it was an invitation, a summons to witness what justice looked like when it wore the mask of terror. And for Robert François Damiens, it was the longest march a man could take, a journey toward a death so intricate, so public, so devastating that his name would live on, not for the wound he gave the king, but for the destruction the king's justice would visit upon him. Part 4. The Stage of Darkness. March 28, 1757. Paris awoke to a sky the color of tarnished iron, a low, sullen ceiling that pressed the city flat beneath its weight. The wind off the Seine was sharp enough to sting the skin, carrying with it the tang of river water and the smoke of morning fires. By dawn, the Place de Grève was no longer a public square. It was an amphitheater of death. They came early. By torchlight, nobles in fur-lined cloaks claimed their places on balconies that overlooked the scaffold. In the press of the square below, commoners jostled for space, their breath rising in small ghostly clouds. The scent of wet wool and unwashed bodies mingled with the more tempting smells from the hawkers weaving through the throng, wine sloshing in clay cups, the sweet heat of roasted chestnuts, the greasy smoke of meat pies. Their cheerful calls to buy and eat clashed painfully with the hush of expectation, like laughter in a church before a funeral. At the center of it all stood the scaffold, a hulking construction of beams, chains, and fresh-sawn timber, its surface already darkened where the cold had bitten the wood. From it ran 4 lengths of thick rope, snaking outward to the edges of the square, where 4 great horses stamped and snorted. Their coats gleamed with sweat in the cold morning light. Their breath steamed in heavy bursts. Their eyes rolled white, catching the flicker of torches. Even they Beasts, bred for work and war, seemed restless, as if they sensed the unnatural labor they had been summoned to perform. When Damiens appeared, flanked by guards in heavy cloaks, the noise of the crowd thinned to a low murmur. He wore a plain white shirt that hung loosely from his shoulders, the color making the iron shackles at his wrists glint sharper in the pale light. His hair was disheveled, his cheeks hollow, his skin the pallor of stone. There was no defiance in his bearing, only a grim, exhausted resignation, as though he had been emptied of everything but breath. His eyes fixed on nothing as they led him to the center of the platform. The ritual began. The first bite of the red-hot pincers tore away a strip of flesh from his arm, the hiss of searing skin meeting the hiss of the iron itself. Damiens screamed, a raw, unbroken sound that bounced off the walls of the surrounding buildings and seemed to hang in the air. Again and again, the pincers bit, chest, arms, thighs, each wound bright and wet in the cold light. Then the molten lead came, poured into the open wounds, the metal spitting as it met the blood, steam curling upward in ghostly tendrils. His body shuddered, his voice breaking into hoarse, desperate cries. Finally, the sulfur was brought to his right hand, the hand that had held the penknife. They burned it until it curled and blackened, until the smell of charred flesh thickened the air and turned stomachs. Only then did the executioners move to the main event. The ropes were fastened, one to each limb, each pulled taut to the waiting horses. The handlers tightened their grips, the whips poised. The signal was given. The air cracked with the sound of leather on flesh as the horses lunged. Damien's body jolted violently, his joints screaming in their sockets, skin stretching to the brink of tearing, but no separation. The horses pulled again, muscles rippling under their hides, hooves scraping and striking the stones. Still nothing. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. This was meant to be swift. It was not. The handlers shouted, the whips struck harder. Foam sprayed from the horses' mouths, their nostrils flared wide. Damien's howls rose and fell, the ropes biting deeper into his limbs, his body drawn toward 4 different horizons at once. Minutes crawled by, then more minutes. Still, his limbs clung stubbornly to his torso, as though even his flesh refused to grant the monarchy the clean death it demanded. The executioners brought out knives. They bent to the work, slicing through tendons, sawing at joints slick with blood. The scaffold grew slippery underfoot, crimson pooling in the grooves of the wood. At last, one arm tore free, then another. But the legs resisted still, the bones grinding and splintering, with a sound that cracked like gunshots in the cold air. By now, the square was silent. Faces were pale, lips pressed thin. Some turned away, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths. Those who had come for a spectacle now saw only the naked machinery of cruelty. At last, after hours of drawn-out torment, the body came apart. What was left of Robber François Damiens was carried to the pyre. The flames rose, hungrily devouring the remnants until they were nothing but ash, scattered into the gray afternoon. The sentence claimed the king's honor had been avenged. But as the crowd dispersed, a heaviness lingered. It was not awe they carried home, but revulsion, a bitter taste that no amount of gold or incense from the altar could ever sweeten again. Part 5. The Shockwave. The smoke from the pyre drifted over Paris long after the crowd had gone. It clung to the narrow streets, seeped into taverns and drawing rooms, into the silks of noblewomen and the hair of children who had been lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to watch. The city smelled faintly of ash and iron for days, but the greater residue was not in the air. It was in the mind. Those who had cheered that morning walked home in silence. Some could not eat, others could not sleep. The image of 4 straining horses and a man who refused to die played again and again behind their eyes. Even at Versailles, the aftershocks were felt. Louis, who had ordered the full weight of the law, heard the reports of how long Damiens had suffered. The king's courtiers said his face hardened, but in private he was troubled. The bien-aimé, the well-beloved, had given the people a memory not of justice, but of the monarchy's naked cruelty. Across Paris, in smoky salons and candle-lit studies, the philosophers of the Enlightenment seized the moment. Voltaire, already a thorn in the side of the establishment, wrote of the barbarity that could exist beneath the polished veneer of civilization. Others passed pamphlets hand to hand, their words a quiet drumbeat for reform. If this is justice, then justice must be remade. Abroad, the tale spread like wildfire. Diplomats wrote home with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. In London, in Amsterdam, in Vienna, the spectacle was held up as proof that France, despite its philosophers and its fashions, was still chained to the gallows of the Middle Ages. The impact was irreversible. Dismemberment by horses, once the ultimate punishment for treason, would never again be carried out in France. Not by decree, but because no executioner, no judge, no king wanted to stand in the shadow of what had happened that day. But the real damage was deeper. The image of absolute monarchy had cracked. The people had seen it for what it was when afraid, not the serene face of divine authority, but the mask ripped away to reveal desperation, fear, and bloodlust. 3 decades later, when the revolution came, the guillotine would replace the scaffold at the Place de Grève. And among the long list of charges against the Bourbon throne, taxation, corruption, indifference, there lingered a memory of a winter morning in 1757, when a servant with a penknife made a king tremble, and the crown answered with a cruelty so grotesque it helped dig its own grave. Robber François Damiens had set out only to touch the king. In the end, he touched something far greater, the conscience of a nation, and once touched, it would never again be still.